All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Plunkett. I'm the manager of outreach here with the Hoosier Environmental Council. Really looking forward to sharing some updates on the Indiana legislative session here with you. Before we get started, I want to share some notes on logistics with you. You should have just gotten a message if you're joining us here on Zoom that we are recording. We're also live streaming on Facebook. If you're joining us via Zoom, I want to encourage you to stay muted, but feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And if you have any questions, whether you're joining us on Facebook or on Zoom, feel free to share those with us and we'll get them shared with our speakers. All right, so if you're not familiar with the Hoosier Environmental Council, here's a little bit about us. We are Indiana's largest environmental education and advocacy organization. We work throughout the state in all of Indiana's 92 counties, and we aim to set a new path for Indiana, encouraging our state to be a state that practices policies that dramatically reduce the footprint of industry, of commerce, of agriculture on the environment. All right, and we have several areas of focus as an organization. We work to promote a sustainable economy for Indiana. We work to fight for environmental health and justice for all Hoosiers, regardless of where they live. And we work to protect our water and wilderness resources throughout the state. How we do this work. So a big part of this work is through our policy work. That's probably why you're joining us here today, to learn more about environmental policy at the state level. We're also involved in engaging and activating and motivating Hoosiers to take action through our outreach work. We also work to hold government and businesses accountable for when they don't uphold environmental regulations. All right, so today's agenda will give you a rundown of what's happened in the 2023 legislative session so far as it pertains to environmental legislation. We'll share a little bit about different policies relating to a sustainable economy, to environmental health and justice, and to protecting our water and wilderness resources. We'll get into the questions you've shared so far and the questions that will be shared throughout the course of this event. And then we'll close with some ways you can get involved and stay up to date with our work at the Hoosier Environmental Council. All right, now I'd like to introduce our legislative team who's joining us here today. Sam Carpenter is our new executive director. He will serve as moderator for today's event. You'll hear from Tim Maloney, who is our senior policy director, Dr. Indra Frank, who is our environmental health and water policy director, Delaney Barber, who is our outreach, climate, and energy coordinator. And of course, my name is Emily Plunkett, and I'm our manager of outreach. I also want to shout out to Jocelyn and Katya, who are also on our team and joining us and helping us out with Zoom and Facebook logistics today. All right, and now I'm going to hand it over to Sam to get us started in this conversation. Take it away, Sam.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. The way we affect policy is really through the voice of people around the state. And what we want to do is channel that voice into shared concerns that we all have through our legislators to make that change. And so we've got a busy session here for you today with lots to cover. I will say I did start late last year with the Hoosier Environmental Council, so I'm thrilled to be here and to be able to make the connections with you all. And again, thanks so much for coming out and joining us, because you have such an impact in supporting HEC and the work we're doing and making the change that we all want to see happen. I'm going to jump in here with talking. I'm going to lead off with Tim. Tim is our senior policy director, and Tim has really taken a big leadership role on conservation funding in this year's legislative session, and work with the Indiana Conservation Alliance to support that effort. So Tim, can you tell us a little bit what is happening at the State House with conservation, our funding request, and what kind of progress we're seeing?
Sure, and thanks, Sam, and good afternoon, everybody. Every 2 years, the state adopts a 2-year budget for Indiana, and this is the budget session for our General Assembly, and it got off to what we thought was a fairly strong start with the governor's proposed agenda, and that agenda, or his budget, included a robust series of conservation investments, starting with $25 million for land conservation, $50 million for trails, added operating support for several of DNR's divisions, including the Division of Fish and Wildlife and their various fish and wildlife protection and management programs. There is money in the budget for a new visitor center at Prophetstown State Park, and then the budget also included administration-wide badly needed salary increases for state staff, particularly those folks at the Department of Environmental Management and at the Indiana DNR. So overall, the HEC and our partners in the Indiana Conservation Alliance were pretty pleased with the governor's proposal. That proposal was then modified during the legislative process by the Indiana House of Representatives, starting in the House Ways and Means Committee and moving through the full chamber. The House adopted a budget bill with changes to the governor's proposals in many program areas. Of most notably, from conservation funding standpoint, is that the House budget cuts the land conservation line item from $25 million to $15 million. And so we were, while most of the other programs survived at the same level, we were disappointed that the House cut that money from the land conservation line item, which would be funding for DNR's President Harrison Conservation Trust. And so we will be working with our partners to restore that funding as the budget bill moves over to the Senate and starts again there. The $25 million that the governor proposed is really quite a remarkable sum compared to a state general fund appropriation going to the DNR's land conservation programs. Up to this point, prior to this year's budget, the entirety of state general fund funding for the Indiana Heritage Trust, which is now the President Harrison Conservation Trust, was roughly $50 million. So this is about half of what historically has been invested in that program to date. Now there's more we can talk about other funding that has gone into both the Harrison Trust and the Bicentennial Nature Trust that was accomplished during Governor Daniels' term, and the last 2-year budget that included allocated some federal dollars through the American Rescue Plan to land conservation, which was also a $25 million line item, but that was wholly federal dollars. So this year's proposal was state general fund dollars, which is what makes that amount so remarkable.
Thanks, Tim. And I think it's interesting to see, that $50 million, that's since inception around 1992. So a 25 million that we're shooting for supporting in this legislative session is a significant sum on a historical perspective. Tim, why do you think, it seems like conservation is a issue that gets bipartisan support. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. Well, there are few issues that typically have broader bipartisan support than conservation. And I think it's a combination of several things. Certainly, our state officials have witnessed more outdoors engagement by Hoosiers, which really grew dramatically during the pandemic and has continued even since that time in terms of state park visitors, trail users, the trade in various outdoor equipment. So that's one factor, is I think the interest and demand from the public and you see that all across Indiana and all across the United States, then there's a growing recognition of the direct economic contribution of outdoor recreation, which depends upon these outdoor lands and trails and parks and water access. That contribution to Indiana's economy is estimated at about $13 billion a year, creating 107,000 direct jobs through the outdoor recreation industry. And then finally, more and more economic officials and folks in commerce recognize how important quality of life and quality of place is to successful and sustainable economic development. So it's just more and more being seen as a central part or component of sound economic strategies as well. So all those things combine to contribute to the interest.
Great. Thanks for that, Tim. And I wonder if you can take a couple minutes and just share any other items that you're really following. And conservation has been a real positive thing. Is there any areas of concern that you're really following at the State House this session?
Well, one other legislative proposal that I'll mention, which I think we'll talk more about in a later section too, is the General Assembly's taking another in-depth look at the way that our state agencies adopt the rules and regulations that implement state law, and that legislative work has happened off and on for many years, and really started to heat up last session with a what we thought was a very bad administrative rulemaking bill that ultimately Governor Holcomb vetoed, to his credit. And then the General Assembly also put in motion a task force to look at administrative rulemaking, and that task force met last fall and came up with a number of recommendations, some of which were positive, some were not. We don't think are as positive, but there are elements of greater transparency in there for state agencies and their rulemaking processes. And so that's House Bill 1623 that has passed the House of Representatives and will be making its way to the Senate. We'll be continuing to work on it. We are opposing that bill at this time because of an amendment that was added in the House, and I think Indra was going to talk about that more a little bit later. So that's one. And I did want to, Sam, also circle back to the budget quickly. Another positive element of the budget bill is an increase for Clean Water Indiana, which is a program administered by the State Department of Agriculture, and along with soil and water conservation districts. And that was boosted in the governor's budget, and the House of Representatives actually increased it by an additional $1.4 million a year. And so that's very positive from that standpoint as well.
Great, thank you. And that's actually a wonderful transition to talking with Indra, who's our water policy director, about a couple things. So Indra, there's been a big focus on wetland protection. There was a lot of concern, a good reason to be concerned, and things that passed in recent years. Do you see anything positive on the wetlands front this year that you're following? And then, more generally with clean water concerns.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Sam, and welcome everybody. Good to be with you this afternoon. It's true, there was harmful legislation passed in 2021. That bill significantly reduced protection for wetlands in Indiana. Then last fall, the Indiana Wetland Task Force issued a good report. One of their main points was that Indiana has already lost too many wetlands and cannot afford to lose any more. That task force recommended a variety of measures for increasing preservation and restoration of wetlands. One of their recommendations was written into a bill and introduced this session. House Bill 1515 by Representative Pat Boy would give property owners a break on their property taxes if they are preserving a wetland. Wetlands do good things for the broader society, so why should we not give people a break if they're preserving a wetland on their private property? The bill would do this in a straightforward manner by simply expanding an existing state program to include more wetlands. Unfortunately, House Bill 1515 did not get a hearing during the first half of the session, but it's not dead yet. We are talking to legislators who've expressed an interest in potentially adding this language on wetlands to another bill that is moving forward. So it's possible we'll see a beneficial bill on wetlands this year.
And Andrew, can I just say that it seems like a theme that we heard in talking with representatives is that they prefer this voluntary type measure rather than regulation. So it seems like that's a strength behind this approach, is that it's providing a voluntary measure that people can elect to preserve wetlands and receive a benefit for that.
No, that's a good point, Sam. I think you're right that our current legislature does have more of a taste for the voluntary incentive.
Other water bills are you following this session?
Well, there are several that I'd like to mention just briefly. Each of these is a bill about water resources that has passed its first chamber, so it's still alive and it's going into the second half of the session. First, there's House Bill 1304 by Representative Abbott. This bill would increase funds for the Lake and River Enhancement Program, and it would do that through a modest increase in registration fees for watercraft. So that's one we're supporting and hoping that will make it through the rest of the process. That's 1304. Then House Bill 1647. This is one by Representative Morris, and it's a bill about septic systems. Currently, our local health departments are responsible for key decisions on septic systems, including installation and decisions when septic systems are failing. This bill, 1647, would allow property owners to overrule those local health department decisions if they can find a private consultant who's willing to declare the system operable. Now, there are many excellent private consultants in Indiana who do work on septic design and installation, but those individuals really should not have the final say in septic decisions since they have a financial stake. This sets up the possibility of a financial conflict of interest. We feel that decisions regarding septic systems should remain in the hands of our public health professionals at the local health departments. So HEC is opposing House Bill 1647. And yeah,
can I just say, haven't we heard a report from, is it IDEM, that we already believe that there's a percentage of something around 20% of septic systems that are failing? We don't need to add to that issue.
Oh, good point, Sam. No, it's very true. Let's see, I'll move along to House Bill 1639. 1639 is by Representative Aylesworth. It's a bill about watershed development commissions. So this bill would create an option for Indiana counties to join together and form a watershed development commission for the watersheds that they share. These commissions would work on both water quantity and water quality issues. Watersheds are the natural boundaries for water movement in the landscape. So it's exciting to see Indiana working to orient our work on water resources to those natural watershed boundaries. During the process, Representative Dvorak worked with Representative Aylesworth to amend 1639 in beneficial ways to make the watershed commissions operate at the right scale and to make sure that they do their work based on studies of their watershed. So this is one that we're supporting. And finally, I wanted to mention Senator Leising's bill, SB 242, about floodplains. This bill points our local county officials to the federal floodplain maps set up by FEMA when they're making decisions about new building permits. And the bill also tells people who are selling property to indicate if that property is in the floodplain on the FEMA floodplain maps. The problem is that the FEMA floodplain maps are incomplete. There are many Indiana streams and rivers that aren't covered on the FEMA maps. We have much more complete maps that were created by the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, but this bill steers people away from those DNR bills, the DNR maps. So our concern is that if this bill goes through, it could mean that decisions on building permits would be made based on FEMA maps, and that could wind up putting more buildings in the floodplain and more people at risk from flooding. Also, if the bill goes through, property buyers could receive false assurance that their property isn't in a floodplain, since only the FEMA map would be consulted. So, and then of course, along with risks to property from putting buildings in the floodplain, our rivers and streams need access to the floodplains during high water in order to stay healthy. So environmentally speaking, building in the floodplain is bad for our rivers and streams. And for these reasons, HEC is opposing Senate Bill 242.
And this is concerning because there's a number of things that are working against flood control. There's the erratic nature of rainfall that's come along with climate change. There's the continued development along the river and in floodplains, and there's the floodplains that have been taken away over the years through development in agriculture. And so as a state, we need to be actively thinking about flooding as an issue that's a growing issue. And it impacts all our insurance premiums it's a cost to the state when the state has to buy out houses that are built in the floodplain or have had serious flooding issues. So that's another consideration as we think about flooding and protection of the floodplain. Indra, was there anything else that you wanted to share here?
If I could, yeah. I wear two hats for HEC. I work on water issues. I also work on environmental health issues. So I'll mention quickly a couple of environmental health related bills. These are bills that have both passed and are moving forward into the second half. One is Representative Jackson's bill, House Bill 1138. 1138 would require child care centers to test their drinking water for lead and take steps if lead is found. Lead is toxic to the nervous system, especially for young children. It can get into drinking water as that water passes through lead pipes or plumbing fixtures. So this bill will be beneficial for Hoosier children. It's had a lot of support so far, and we're hoping it'll make it through to the final process. And then second, Representative Bauer introduced House Bill 1219. This has also passed the House and moves now into the Senate. 1219 sets up a monitoring program for the blood levels of PFAS chemicals in our firefighters. Firefighters have especially been exposed to PFAS chemicals since firefighting foams have for many years contained these chemicals. As more and more data are coming out about the PFAS chemicals, we're learning about how they're linked to a variety of serious health conditions, including cancer. And it turns out they are very persistent once they're released to the environment. So this is a good bill, both for our firefighters and because it sets up mechanisms for the state to kind of increase its attention to the PFAS chemicals. So House Bill 1138 about lead and House Bill 1219 about PFAS. They're both headed into the Senate, and they're bills that HEC is supporting.
And the PFAS issue is a issue of concern. There are so many varieties of the PFAS chemical compounds, and there needs to be more regulation of that. We are hearing occasionally companies starting to commit to not using PFAS in their materials, but this is definitely an issue that we need to all keep our eyes on. Thank you for that, Indra. I'm gonna move to Delaney. Delaney works on climate as well and energy, as well as outreach with HEC. And Delaney, you've been real involved with the efforts around Senate Bill 335, which would create a climate solutions task force. Can you talk a little bit about that bill? We had this bill showed quite a bit of bipartisan support. Can you just give us an update on what happened there?
Yes, thank you, Sam. So Senate Bill 335 had a lot of momentum, and it was a big deal for climate action in the state because it got a hearing in Senate Environmental Affairs, and there was a lot of bipartisan support. We especially want to thank the lawmakers who signed on to the bill, which were authors, Senator Shelley Yoder, Senator Ron Alting, and Senator John Ford. The co-authors that were added on were Senator Bassler, Senator Becker, Senator Kadora, and Senator Durnell and Senator J.D. Ford. So we want to thank them for their support. And like Sam said, it would look to create a climate task force, climate solutions task force. So knowing that climate change is a problem, we want to try to plan and prepare for those effects, some of which we are already dealing with, especially with flooding and some extreme weather changes in our winter, which I think we had the warmest February on record in Indiana, unfortunately. And the youth behind this, Confront the Climate Crisis, did a tremendous job at speaking to people throughout the state, getting support on this, working together with us. And again, it would have looked at some mitigation, so decreasing our emissions, as well as adaptation, which involves our farmers and agriculture. It involves our schools and local governments on planning and preparing for climate change. And with so much bipartisan support, this says a lot about the issue of climate change in the state of Indiana, and that there are people on both sides of the aisle that are trying to take it seriously for what it is.
Thanks, Delaney. Yeah, there were 5 Republican authors or co-authors and 3 Democrat authors and co-authors on this bill. We were disappointed that it didn't receive a vote in the committee, but the Confront the Climate Crisis, my friends with Earth Charter are continuing to work on this and see how this climate task force can be pushed forward. Delaney, what are some other bills that you're watching in the State House this session?
So I am looking at a lot of bills having to do with our energy and trying to decrease our emissions and looking towards the future in our energy transition to more clean and reliable sources. One bill is Senate Bill 33, which passed out of the Senate. And that would look at decommissioning and disposal of solar and wind systems. So what happens at end of life, and making sure that companies that are setting up in local communities, that burden of cleanup, or when these solar systems or wind systems run their course, and if they're not being re-upped, what happens with those? This is especially important with our solar systems because there's a lot of precious metals in them that can be reused. And there's a lot of research going into that now to see how industry can respond quickly when we have solar waste in the future. But a lot of solar panels are actually outlasting some of their end of use dates already. And then I'm also watching Senate Bill 221, which also passed. And it would look at a energy audit for the Indiana state government campus. They haven't done this before, but they are looking to decrease their emissions and also save money. Something that hopefully this will set a good example for other companies or communities looking to do the same thing. And then the last one, we're looking at House Bill 1007, which goes into our energy utility decision-making. And we're watching any amendments that might be added to this bill. And the bulk of this bill is trying to include reliability, affordability, resiliency, stability, and environmental sustainability in our energy decision-making. But currently the environmental sustainability definition doesn't really include a robust definition of what that is. And we want to make sure if we're guiding policy for the future and our future decisions that we're seriously considering that environmental sustainability component.
Thanks, Delaney. And I think one of the things that we keep in mind is there, as you know, Indiana has a pipeline, a strong renewables pipeline of industrial solar and wind energy. But there's a lot of challenges in getting those sited and built. And there's a lot of barriers put into place in terms of getting distributed or more local solar options, solar on your rooftop or in your community. And so, you know, more broadly, Hoosier Environmental Council is also working on those issues and advocating for those issues. A lot of change right now is happening through the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's a lot of federal push and federal dollars that are moving this along. So as Indiana, as a state, our legislature, one is we're experiencing the impacts of climate change and they're hearing the voices of people. This is an issue that Hoosiers care about and want to see action taken on. And there's federal incentives. There's a lot of federal dollars that are out there that are helping move this forward. So I think it's positive that some steps are being taken, but it really does take an approach of looking at industrial renewables, local and distributed, and energy efficiency in many types of movement there. So lots happening there and focus for us. Delaney, can you talk a little bit about Senate Bill 9 and kind of what happened with that and kind of your impressions there?
Yes, so Senate Bill 9 is a bill we were watching and seeing how it developed. That looked to involve kind of the state more in investor-owned utility energy planning. And every 3 years, this investor-owned utilities have to put a integrated resource plan forward. And that kind of scopes out what their plan is for the next 20 years of meeting their customers' energy needs. And they put in some stipulations which were later removed, but they still are adding oversight into this process that in between those 3 years, between IRPs, which have a lot of stakeholder engagement, and comment periods, public meetings about them, that if they were to retire a coal plant early, that they would have to get approval from the IRC, and the IRC has the right to also investigate it. They took away that certificate, but it's still, they have to notify the IRC, and then the IRC can decide if they want to investigate that. But the main motivation of this bill, which was said by the author in the Senate Utilities Committee, that they don't want to quicken the energy transition and are worried that we are moving too quickly towards renewable energy sources and questioning the reliability of these renewable energy sources and sticking with coal, which is a majority of where our energy comes from. So we're continuing to watch this and speak against some of the concerns about renewable energy and promote that it is reliable, it's affordable, it's resilient, and it's a lot cleaner and has far less impacts than coal does.
Thanks, Delaney. And there was a lot of concern expressed by people on the Utilities Committee that was considering that bill around the transition away from fossil fuels. Now, a little fact check there is that fossil fuels are still making up 60% of Indiana's energy use. Solar, which they're talking about disrupting the grid, is around 2%. So there's a lot of room to grow and fit into our transmission system with renewables. The utility companies have said that they've created plans that they think are sustainable and reliable for renewables being introduced. So what we had was a lot of people out of state representing coal that were talking about the need for coal for reliability. So that's something that we really have to keep an eye on as a state. I want to get to some of y'all's questions here, and one of them was about the climate bill in the House, and Delaney, I believe that did not receive a hearing. Is there any action happening there?
No, those did not receive a hearing. There was a House version of the task force bill. There was also a study committee, and then a greenhouse gas emissions inventory bill. But we are continuing to work since the climate task force bill did at least get a hearing, which is a big deal, with our partners in Confront the Climate Crisis to keep that conversation going in the State House, since there was so much momentum this year.
And I know we had a question earlier about coal and what's happening with that. Tim was going to talk a little bit about coal and rulemaking. Tim, can you give us an update on what's happening with coal ash?
Yeah, Sam, I talked about this rulemaking bill earlier, House Bill 1623, and in House committee, that bill was amended to add language prohibiting the Department of Environmental Management from adopting any new coal ash rules from being more stringent than the federal coal ash rule, or acting in areas where the federal coal ash rule was silent. Very extreme language that we're opposed to, and has a direct effect on IDEM's current rulemaking to establish a coal ash state permit program, which is in process right now. And as part of that rulemaking, IDEM is proposing to fill in gaps left by the federal coal ash rule. And that's exactly what this amendment language is intended to prevent. So we're greatly concerned about that. That bill, as we said earlier, has passed the House with that amendment language, and so we'll be working to stop that or get it changed in the Senate as it goes forward.
Great, thank you. There was some other, Indra, were you going to make another comment about that? I saw you came off.
Oh, thanks, Sam. Yeah, I wanted to send out kudos to Representative Pat Boy and Senators Rodney Paul and Sue Glick, who introduced bills that would have been beneficial on coal ash and made coal ash disposal safer in Indiana. Those bills were not heard, and so they're dying now at the midpoint of the session.
Great, thanks for that, Indra. There were some questions that have been submitted in the chat. I want to get to some of those. There were some that were submitted ahead of time. One is Rachel asked, what bills are in the works or related to climate smart agriculture or state-based carbon markets for farmers? And I know there's some federal action there, but Tim, can you talk a little bit about what's happened with carbon market and in relation to Rachel's question?
Yes, there's no legislation proposed this session to directly address either of those topics. There was a bill introduced and considered in the 2021 session. And although that bill did not pass, the upshot of it was that the Indiana State Department of Agriculture and the Indiana DNR created a carbon markets working group and brought together a variety of stakeholders to talk about the state's role in promoting and overseeing carbon markets. HEC was part of that task force, along with some of our allies and ag people and forestry people and agency people. To this point, that working group has not reached any consensus. The original language in that 2021 bill would have created a state oversight role for carbon markets that was comparable to language in a federal proposal, what was called the Growing Climate Solutions Act, that Indiana U.S. Senator Mike Braun was one of the co-authors of that. That federal legislation was actually included in the omnibus appropriations package that was adopted by Congress in December. I don't know that that's gotten a lot of attention yet in Indiana, but that language has now become law at the federal level, and a key part of that bill is to create a greenhouse gas technical assistance provider and third-party verification program. That's to address two of the key questions and concerns about carbon markets these days, which is the accountability of carbon offset projects, and also ensuring that qualified people are involved in the verification of the offsets that get put into carbon markets and then sold, to demonstrate that these offsets truly are making an additional carbon reduction. And there have been problems with low quality carbon offset projects that simply weren't providing the advertised carbon offset. So I think with the passage of this federal bill, there will be, I think, less momentum for state legislation that would do essentially the same thing. But and there are companies now enrolling both farmers and woodland owners in Indiana in carbon market programs. We have, on the forest side, we have NCX is operating a forest carbon market in Indiana, and Indigo and Truterra are both enrolling farmers in soil-based carbon sequestration markets. So those opportunities do exist now. And I just conclude by saying, when you talk about climate smart agriculture, the programs that work to conserve soils and make soils healthier, those practices that do that are the exact same practices that enhance carbon sequestration in soils. So, I mean, climate smart agriculture is going on now, and it's growing in popularity. It still has a long way to go before it covers all of our ag land, but a lot of that's already underway, and so it calls into question just what legislation is needed other than ensuring that the markets are accountable and verifiable. So,
thanks, Tim. Yeah, your part about climate smart agriculture is a natural time for me to plug our From Farm to Field workshop that we're doing with former Colts punter. I see Jenny's on here, who's organizing this event on March 8th. But Hunter Smith, former Colts player, is going to be talking about, sharing some about his farm and regenerative farming practices. So Emily, if you could put a link in there to that event, that's going to be March 8th at 1 p.m. as well as a virtual event. We've had a couple questions about fines around air pollution and other fines. There was a question specifically about the item air pollution control bill, Senate Bill 155. I don't know, Indra, is that something you can speak to?
Sure, be happy to, Sam. Yeah, this is a good question. Senate Bill 155 will increase the fees that the industries pay for their air permits. Pardon me. Sorry about that. IDEM needs this bill to adjust the permit fees in order to continue operating Indiana's air permit program. But the fees in this bill are not related to fines for violations.
I'll add to that this is a program that, with its success of reducing the amount of pollution going into the atmosphere, into the air, by the very nature of it, the level of the fees has gone down. So it's kind of a victim of its own success. So they need to reset the fees so that this program continue. If the program doesn't continue on a state level, then the EPA will pick up regulation and we'll have federal regulation of our air. Indra, do you want to add anything beyond that? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, that had to happen at least once, right? You're absolutely right that, yeah, if IDEM does not get this adjustment to the permit fees, EPA has already indicated that it might have to step in and take over the air permit program for Indiana.
Okay, Gary asked in the chat if $1 bazillion is going to go for IEDC for industrial sprawl development. Gary raised an issue with us around the Boone County LEAP project, which is a large development that's happening around Lebanon. And it's actually, so Hoosier Environmental Council believes in smart development that can be supported by the natural resources around it and minimizing the environmental impact. Now, this is an instance where this particular development is going to require millions of gallons of water to be piped daily to support the level of development that they're going. So we're really looking at how is that's going to affect the Wabash River, how is it going to affect wetlands in this area, and we're starting to look into this as we hear from Gary and other people who are concerned about this issue. We are scheduling a meeting with the IEDC to learn more about the environmental impact studies that they're doing, and are there ways to do this project in a environmentally responsible way. And there are a lot of developments across the state. You see these huge warehouses. And so we want to be advocates for smart development that can be supported and that's going to minimize environmental impacts of destruction of natural spaces and wetlands and other. There was, I believe, $500 million in the state budget for the IEDC, at least. So yes, a lot of money is going toward that. Let's see, there's another question here. Oh, Tim, the question Tim had, the invasive species department been funded through the DNR budget?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Senate Bill 412 has a number of provisions for our Department of Natural Resources, including extending their invasive species council. I think the bill extends it to 2031. Yeah.
In Indra, there's an update on that. Senator Glick actually had to remove that language from 412 because it was deemed non-germane.
Okay.
So she is going to be looking for another host for that language to to extend the council.
Oh, thank you, Tim.
Okay, let's see. Other questions. We had a comment from Dee, who's the Executive Director of Alliance of Indiana Rural Water, and very concerned about the environment and its impacts on water quality. And we share that concern, Dee, and appreciate having partners to work with on these issues. Let's see, Emily, why don't you chime in if I've missed any of the participants' questions. I'm going to go in now to one of the things, and I'm going to put this out to my policy team, and y'all can say who wants to answer this, but what legislation or efforts bring you the most hope for Indiana's environmental future? Delaney, go for it.
Well, we definitely have already mentioned this before, but I think this session we are seeing a lot of positive bills in general on environmental policy. And as Tim mentioned, this all feeds into being climate resilient and being ready and taking climate change seriously, as it's already impacting us, that we're getting more momentum than ever about climate change, that we're able to say climate change in the State House and have discussions about it. And hopefully with the federal momentum and funding as well, it's really going to push the needle forward, just because we want this funding, even if if someone doesn't agree with maybe everything about climate change, but that we're taking it seriously.
Great, thank you. A question, another question raised was, what legislation is most concerning? I want to speak to this a little bit. It's not about particular legislation, but I'm somewhat new to this process, and some things that that I see are this kind of constant pushback on protections, eating away a little by little at our around, wetlands, flood protection, water protection, and as there is a strong push for renewables, there is also a counter push that is well funded by out-of-state efforts, and by fossil fuel companies to really push back on this drive to renewables. So we have to be ever vigilant and aware and organizing on these issues. I would say there's also, I see a general lack of understanding kind of the value of our natural world and our ecosystems and how those are interconnected, as well as this importance of shifting to a carbon future. And I think, one thing that we can do and people can do in general is to educate our legislators about this in a respectful way. I think some folks are really open to hearing this message and want to have a better understanding. And that's important to hear from you as their constituency. And then I would say just, this general resistance to change. Tim was talking about some of the agriculture policy and incentives that are available that are good for farmers, and this idea of cover cropping and no-till, and there's a lot of benefits. And sometimes they don't do it just basically because it's change. And I think some of this, push towards, renewables or electric vehicles, there's just resistance to change. And so that requires that we're continuing to have that in the forefront of the conversation and discussion, as well as hearing from all of you. Emily, can you put up our last slide about ways to make a difference? And then I'll ask if anybody on the policy team has any final comments they'd like to share. Thanks, Emily. So how can you make a difference? One is to be informed, and you're doing that here today. You obviously have an interest, and the people that here are probably, many of you are already active advocates, and that's wonderful. So in doing this yourself and encouraging others as well, is to connecting with your state legislators. If you can have an in-person meeting, or if you can attend one of their third house meetings, where you can share your own experience, your own life experience, and the value of environmental issues and how that impacts you and your family. If you can share that with legislators, that makes a big difference. If you have a relationship with them, then you're in the best position to have an impact. You can call and email when we're talking about these bills with folks. If they've heard from people in their districts, then they're going to listen to us more than if they haven't. You can write a letter to the editor about issues that you can care about. We are always looking for volunteers, and we're building a volunteer program to help educate and mobilize Hoosiers, and just encouraging other folks to get involved. And if you want to reach out to us, Emily can put her email there. There's our Bill Watch page, where we continually update that to put the things that we're watching. HEC is watching over 80 bills, so we don't put everything on our Bill Watch page, but we do have that as a resource for you. Also sign up for our weekly e-newsletters, social media, and we'll share a lot about what's going on there. Okay. Let's see. I see a comment here, Liz Silver. Governor asked for the IDC budget, or specific $300 million for annual deal-making fund and $150 million for revolving loan fund for acquisition. Okay, so some more information in the chat there about the IDC. Do we know if these were approved? I do believe that quite a bit of funding. I don't know the specifics of the funding for the IDC, but I thought it was 500 million.
Yeah, Sam,
Yeah.
I posted a link to the House budget bill version, a slide presentation about it. The deal closing fund is at $500 million now, and the same 150 million for the revolving fund for site acquisition.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Well, we've come to the end of our hour. Again, thank you for joining us today and being part of this, and for the work that you're doing in your own communities and with your own organizations. And I think with that, we'll we put a link in there for the farming workshop. Sign up for our newsletter, and we'll continue to work on your behalf at the State House, as well as do our best to keep you informed. So thanks, everybody.